starting in chapter 4 and verse 13 and going through verse 11 of chapter 5, we have a section dealing with the second coming, in which Paul first deals with the state of the dead, and that those who have died will not lose their reward. But as far as the time of the second coming, we don't know when. The time is uncertain, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 5. And so, starting in verse 4 of chapter 5, we have the need for watchfulness. And in our study, we were looking at verse 5. Therefore, let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. The idea of sleep, of course, would be the idea of being indifferent, not knowing. There's many who live their lives that way with no view whatsoever, dealing, of course, with the second coming. Live as if Christ is never going to come, that there's never going to be any accounting in their life. So we are not to sleep as others do. The others, of course, would be, within context, those who are not living in light of the second coming, those in the world primarily. Instead, we are to watch and be sober. We were talking about this word watch last week when we ended. It is literally to be aroused from sleep or to watch, but is used metaphorically as being vigilant as opposed to being indifferent. And you can see the contrast between sleep and watching in that sense. If sleeping is used in that sense of being indifferent, now then, let us watch. There's that vigilance that we put into our lives to live in view of the second coming, not to be indifferent. One had stated that it's a determined wakefulness, a staying awake to watch and never going to sleep. And the present tense of this, let us literally continue to watch, would indicate that type of a lifestyle. And again, the context here would be in particular dealing with the second coming. Someone turn over to Philippians 3 and verse 20 and read that for us, and someone else be turning to Titus 2, verse 11 through 13.
For our conversation is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ.
The word conversation means manner of life. It's an old English word, conversation. Our manner of life is in heaven, where we look for what? The second coming, the coming of our Lord. And so we are constantly looking for the Lord in the way in which we live our lives. In Titus 2, verses 11 through 13, what do we find?
Well, the grace of God that bringeth salvation hath appeared to all men, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live sober, righteous, and godly in this present world, looking for that blessed hope and the glorious appearing of the great God and our Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity and purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works.
Okay, that's going through verse 14. Which is fine, but verse 14 deals more with an identification of Jesus. The grace of God teaches us three things. We deny, we live, and we look. that looking is for that second coming. And so we're denying and living in view of that second coming at all times. Problem is, so many don't. Sober, then, let us watch and be sober. It's an old verb that literally means not to be drunk. But in the New Testament, it is always used in a metaphorical sense or a figurative sense of being sober-minded. Pfeiffer and Harrison state that this, quote, speaks not so much of freedom from drunkenness as of rigidly disciplining all of one's life so as to be well balanced in every phase, end quote. It is that idea that is being set forth here. It's not necessarily being free from intoxicating beverages. We'll get to that in a minute. It is that sober-mindedness, someone who is disciplining their life, controlling their life, so that they do not live contrary to God's word. Because why? They're watching for that second coming. Now then, I said we'd get to the idea of drunkenness even in this verse, in this word, I mean. It's being used in a figurative sense, granted that. But you can only understand the figurative sense in light of its original meaning, which is being free of intoxicating beverages. One cannot be sober-minded in the way in which it's being used here if he's imbibed in beverage alcohol. Beverage alcohol destroys that ability to be sober-minded. And so they do go together. But what is being emphasized in this verse, at least, when he says sober, is that sober-mindedness, free from intoxicating beverages. That would also be free from other things that would cause us not to be sober-minded, not just intoxicating beverages. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. The condition that it creates with the mind. You could, for example, let me use another illustration instead of alcohol. Marijuana. Even though they try and claim that marijuana is harmless, but it's not. It can cause a state of where you cannot be sober-minded. So what originally the word in its literal sense is being free from intoxicating beverages, when it comes over to this being sober-minded, it would also go back. It's not just beverage alcohol, it would be anything that would cause the state of mind so it's not sober. And so it would include more than just the beverage alcohol. Years ago, we heard a lot about LSD, mind-altering drugs. It can include those, how can I express this, legal drugs that are prescribed for us. Have you ever seen someone walking around in a stupor almost because they are on so much medication that they really can't think right and think straight. Well, that's the opposite of this idea of being sober.
Well, the law changed from DWI to DUI. DUI is driving under the influence.
Right. Of anything, DUI, not just alcohol. And that's why the breath test doesn't always work. So what do they do then? They get a blood test, and then they check the levels of things in your blood that would cause you to be in that state. So I'm not trying to, just alcohol, but alcohol certainly is involved in this. And I'll get a little bit more in that in just a moment with verse 7.
You can have your mind all intoxicated with all kind of worldly thoughts and things going on in God's Word.
You can. To use the idea that you just expressed with the Thessalonians, they were under intense persecution. Could they be so concentrating on that persecution and that they couldn't even think straight about other things? Well, sure they could. So it would go back and even include things likened to that. Sober-mindedness is a broad term in that sense that sets forth a person who is able to discipline himself and control himself and his actions, his thoughts, his actions, and his speech. We could be intoxicated with rage in that sense. Have you ever seen anyone with road rage? Whew. That can be some of the worst. And they can't think straight even. Why? They're intoxicated with that rage. Pam? All of those things, if our minds get to that extreme, we're no longer being sober-minded. And thus it makes that ability to watch for the... let's see, Lipscomb's commentary, it was actually Shepard who wrote this, stated, what horror could be more awful than to be overtaken in this state? Take the road rage again. What if the Lord came then? Would you really want to be in that type of state? That's the idea of watch and be sober. They're not watching, they're not sober-minded. In verse 7 then, for they that sleep in the night, and they that be drunken are drunken in the night. Here Paul is dealing with the conduct of those who are living their lives unprepared for the second coming. They are those who sleep and are drunken. Both of them primarily actions that are done at night. And if you go back to the latter part of this verse, drunken in the night. These are actions that are basically done in the night. That doesn't mean they're exclusively done then. But from a general standpoint, these individuals that he's describing now are living their lives carelessly, licentiousness, drunkenness, sinful lives is what they're doing. They're living in sin. As opposed to the Christian who's watching and being sober. Paul is presenting through this a strong contrast, one as opposed to the other. Christians living their lives one way, people who aren't living in another way. Sleep is actually from the same word as in verse 6. They that sleep, or therefore let us not sleep as do others. They that sleep then, and this again present tense. They that continue to sleep in the night. And drunken, both of those words are present tense, continuous action. Let's look at these words though. First word, drunken, here. It is, no, wrong. This word, methusko, in the Greek. There's the Greek here. And then if you were looking at the transliterating it into English, you would have that. They that drunken. The second drunken, or drunken in the night, is this word, methuo. Do you see a similarity there between that word, methuo, the second one, and methusko, the first one? Yeah, shake or nod. Look at this. methysko. methyo. The SK. They do have the same root. But here's the point. And they both mean drunk. The thing is, when you add this SK ending there, SK, that's a sigma kappa out. Sigma kappa. And then the ending O. When you add that SK ending, it makes it what is called, it's called three different things, so you can use any of these: an inceptive verb, or an incohative verb, or an ingressive verb, depending on, some of them will use all three terms. Some use one term, others use the other term. The best way, I think, George Curtius, in his Grammar of the Greek Language, states that, quote, denotes a beginning or coming into being. Now that's the first word, a coming into being or a beginning. And Generius, in his historical Greek grammar, chiefly of the Attic dialect, stated, quote, denoting the inception of an action or condition. Now this is true in any word that has this SK ending. So they took this methuo and added the SK ending. Why? To show the beginning of something that's going to take place, whatever the verb is. In this place, drunk. And so you have the beginning of, or the inception of an action of being drunk. Thus, when you come back to this, and where we are, they that be drunken, that's with the SK ending, the beginning of the process, the beginning of it. Are drunken deals with the state. Now then, how do you begin the process of getting to the state of being drunk? When you take the very first drink. That's when you begin that process of getting to the state of being drunk. You could. And you're thinking about it. Well, that may be the beginning of the process too, yes. That's Proverbs, what chapter? I've forgotten. You're supposed to know that off the top of your head. You're the preacher. I was going to and continue reading, and you'll come across, but starting in Proverbs 1:1. Somebody turn over to Leviticus, the 10th chapter, and read verses 8 through 12. Well, let me do it, because that way I can stop during the middle. And the Lord spake unto Aaron. Okay, Aaron is the head of the Aaronic priesthood. So what he's going to state to Aaron is something for all of the priests of Israel. Do not drink wine nor strong drink, thou nor thy sons with thee, when you go into the tabernacle of the congregation, lest ye die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, and that ye may put difference between holy and unholy, between unclean and clean, that ye may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord had spoken unto them by the hand of Moses. A statute forever that priests are not to drink wine or strong drink. Well, that was going to be the next point. What do we find in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 5 and verse 9? We are all priests and offering up spiritual sacrifices. Now, you have a typology in the Old Testament of here's the priest. They are not to drink wine or strong drink. And notice that you can put a difference between the holy and the unholy, the clean and the unclean. What is he saying? If you drink, you're not holy. Aren't we to be holy today? Can you drink then? Aren't we to be clean today and not unclean? Of course. One of the ways of putting that distinction or difference is between when you drink. Let's see. There's another passage in relationship to this, and that would be Proverbs 31 and verse 4. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for the princes strong drink. Kings are not to drink. priests are not to drink. Are we not a kingdom of priests today? Revelation 1 and verse, I believe it's 6. Also royal priesthood, royal being kingly priesthood, 1 Peter 2 verse 9. If what we find in the Old Testament, priests were not to drink, kings were not to drink, what does that mean for Christians? We don't drink alcoholic beverages.
Some people apply that to like the elders, like in the qualification of the deacon, they can have a little wine. Some have no wine. So it's a
Yes.
That's some argument.
The passage I always refer to is James 1, and I think it's verse 21. I'd have to look again, but that says that we are not to be overflowing or the superfluity of naughtiness, overflowing of naughtiness. Now then, does that mean that we can all be a little bit naughty? As long as we're not overflowing naughty?
That's the argument.
Yeah, but they've got to face that. The reason they make that argument is very simply they want to drink. And they want to find an excuse for it. The phraseology is in reality that they're saying don't do it at all. In both cases, both with elders and deacons. Do not drink. It just being expressed in different ways. That's why James 1, the overflowing or superfluity of naughtiness. Well, nobody understands that as being you can be a little bit naughty and it's all right. Why? The argument that they're making would demand that we can be a little naughty. And it'd be all right, as long as it doesn't go to that overflowing of naughtiness. And there's other passages likened to that, but
Is it American Standard Version used for all of it? Instead of just become addicted to it?
yeah, become addicted to it in the original. Another argument that's often used is that where Jesus is called that John came neither eating nor drinking. They said he had a devil. Jesus says, I have come, and they've said I'm a winebibber and glutton. Well, does that mean that since they said these things, does that mean that John the Baptist had a devil? Because you have it in the same statement. Nobody believes that. Why should we believe what they said then about Jesus being a winebibber and a glutton? There's no reason to. Just like John the Baptist didn't have a devil or a demon. Jesus was not a gluttonous man or a winebibber. Wanted to deal with the idea of if you're one drink, you are one drink drunk. Could I put it the opposite way? If you're one drink, you're one drink less sober. If 1 ounce of alcoholic beverage, that's let's say 20% alcohol, and you drink that 1 ounce beverage, you are as much as that 1 ounce beverage of 20% alcohol, you are that to that degree drunk. You take 5 drinks of that, you would then be 5 drinks of that 20% alcohol drunk. 10 drinks drunk. So go back to the 1 drink, you're 1 drink drunk. Becoming drunk to where you get to the state of drunkenness, let's say, is a progressive journey. Our courts and laws recognize that. That's why we have that limit that is set. You can drink so much as long as you don't go over the 0.08% of blood level alcohol. Some of them have it 0.1 in it, but I think most have changed to the 0.8. Because we recognize there is a process to it. We recognize it with the terms that we use of people who's drunk. Someone who just, a little bit happy, they're a little tipsy. As opposed to someone who can't even walk straight and they're falling down drunk, they're soused. Yeah, a little buzz over here to about he just passing out drunk. Alcohol deadens the brain the very first thing. That is the first thing that happens, is there is a deadening of the brain that takes place from the standpoint of it depresses that area of the brain that has moral clarity. That's why you see people doing things when after they've taken a few drinks that they would never do if they hadn't done that. Why? Because that area of the brain that the alcohol has attacked is that moral sensibilities. Now then, if we take 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks, more, how much does the New Testament allow us to drink before we sin? Well, here they that be drunken start the process of drinking, be the very first drink. And so you are to that extent drunk. And by the way, we call it someone who is intoxicated. Think of that word for a second. What's the root of it? Toxic. What is something that is toxic? Poison. Intoxication. What are you doing? You're poisoning yourself. People don't think about those things, do they?
So even in the medical profession, if you're under any influence, like just mild, I give you something mild, like I have to go have the heart attack. I didn't even know where to give me anything that they said. They wouldn't let me make any kind of decision until I'm completely out of all that. 24 hours.
Then
They could ask you a question about what they want.
Yeah, that's the medical profession when it gets to the drugs that they give you, and you don't even realize it sometimes, but legally you're not allowed to make a decision for 24 hours until all of that gets out of your system. And let me add, when we're talking about this and drinking alcohol, We're not discussing medication. Now then, medication can be abused. Understand that, we need to understand that, but proper medication, we're not talking about that. We're not discussing also alcohol that's in food, cooking alcohol. Not discussing that, because all of the alcohol basically is cooked out of that. It's not also a discussion of an accidental consumption of alcohol. We're talking about those who would go and intentionally consume beverage alcohol. For whatever the reason they may give, to relax them. Now that ought to tell us something too, shouldn't it? It's relaxing the brain. Pleasure, forgetting our problems, escapism, whatever it might be. That's what we're talking about. And when doing that, when you take the very first drink, you are to that extent drunk. The second drunken here, they that be drunken, are drunken, that one, that's dealing with the state of drunkenness. The first one, that beginning the process, and then you're in the state. Raymond Kelsey wrote this about these verses. Drunkenness adds to insensitivity. It is therefore to be expected that those who live lives devoid of sobriety, who are drunken and stupefied by sin, should thus be without feeling. For literal drunkenness is most often associated with literal darkness. Start drinking, don't care about others, don't care about self in reality, don't care about anything. You lose those sensibilities. Christians need to avoid it, period. Now again, we're not talking about alcohol that's in medicine, because it can help get the medicine to your body in reality. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about these other things. We're talking about people who intentionally drink. And there's some who are going to do it no matter what is said. Let me address one other aspect. How many of you have heard that taking, for example, a glass of wine at night is good for you? Most of you. Do you now know that they have found that that's a lie? It does not help any at all. It harms the body. And the harm that it does far outweighs any good that might be there. So this idea that has been promoted, and anytime you get into a discussion of the sin of alcoholic beverages, you generally hear that. Well, no, that's been disproven. And the facts are that any amount of drinking is harmful, but any amount of drinking is sinful as well. And we need to remember that. Comments, questions? Beating a dead horse now? And the reason is, it's so prevalent. and sadly so prevalent even in the church. I could take you and show you tons of congregations who never would preach against the sin of social drinking because so many of their members do that. I know preachers who do that, so-called preachers. So it's something that we have to continue to harp upon because it's so overwhelming in our society. And even those who advertise alcohol now, what have they started putting on their advertisements? A warning to do what? Drink responsibly. Well, in reality, I would agree with that, not in their definition of it, but drinking responsibly is absolutely not drinking it. But why do they have to put a warning out like that when they're advertising their product? Pam? Mm-hmm. In the Catholic religion, because the priest so many times would drink and it was alcoholic wine, they have had through the years a huge problem with alcoholism among their priests. That's true. Just a sad fact. And by the way, in getting into some discussions, you'll hear about the Lord's Supper, the bread and the wine. You ever heard that? Not, in fact, I had one person tell me the original Greek states it's wine. So I went through every passage in the New Testament about the Lord's Supper dealing with it's not wine, it's fruit of the vine. Not one time is it ever called wine. It is always fruit of the vine. But we get into these discussions, well, that's supposed to be wine. Well, no, it's just fruit of the vine. Grape juice suffices. It doesn't have to be fermented. That's the point. Every time in the New Testament, it's always fruit of the vine. In every passage. Never does he use the term wine.
I've heard some say that wine was so prevalent back there, and they talked about wine all through the Old Testament, New Testament.
Mm-hmm.
You know they had to drink wine. Just assume something.
They do. I've got passage after passage showing that what was considered the very best wine. Now understand, from a biblical standpoint and from that time frame, the term wine was a term that embraced any type of juice from the vine. And even in Isaiah, it mentions the juice that is still in the grape. Let's see you get fermented out of that. But always, the very best wine was always considered the non-alcoholic type. Plus, they had numerous ways of preserving the grape juice so it would not ferment. I believe it's the Baker's Pictorial Dictionary listed 14 different ways that they would use to preserve the grape juice without any alcohol being in it. Well, next week we'll start with verse 8 then.